I'm Francis Durnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, further to our usual updates from the front line of the war, we ask a sobering question. Do the attacks around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant risk another Chernobyl?
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Friday, the 12th of August, day 170. And today I'm joined by two guests new to the podcast. The first, Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, is a chemical weapons expert and formerly a British Army officer for 23 years. He was the commanding officer of the UK's Joint Chemical, Biological, Radiological and Nuclear Regiment and NATO's Rapid Reaction CBRN Battalion. Our second guest is Mariam Naim, a Ukrainian cultural researcher of Afghan origin. She'll be offering reflections on how Russian aggression gave birth to the Azov Battalion and other far-right elements in Ukraine, and how the war is shaping Ukrainian attitudes to both their country and themselves. But before that, here are our headlines for today. Ukraine and Russia have accused each other of risking nuclear disaster by shelling Europe's largest nuclear power plant, occupied by Russian forces in a region expected to become one of the next big front lines of the war. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky told officials to stop talking to reporters about Kyiv's military tactics against Russia, saying late on Thursday that such remarks were, quote, frankly irresponsible. Ukrainian children returning to school after the summer holidays will be taught lessons on how to avoid mines and other dangerous objects left over from the war with Russia. And finally, Liverpool, Glasgow and Birmingham are among the cities shortlisted to host the 2023 Eurovision Song Contest in the UK, as Ukraine, winners of this year's competition, will not be able to host the event due to the war. The Telegraph's defence and security editor, Dominic Nicholls, has just returned from Denmark, where he was joining the British Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, who we heard in our episode yesterday. Before talking to our guests, I started by asking him about the latest news from his trip and about the conversations taking place among senior Western officials.
Hi, Francis. Hi, everybody. So this was the donor aid conference in Copenhagen, 26 nations plus the EU present to provide money and pledges of support for Ukraine in terms of training, and there was some demining. That's why I had the phrase in my head. Apologies for that. And so the press conference yesterday afternoon, there were no details of individual items of equipment that's going to be sent out. However, they confirmed, as I said yesterday, that we heard by lunchtime that there was a pot of cash. Importantly, cash, not just sort of pledges, of 450 million euro. So the Brits put in 300 million, and the Danes put in 110, and then there were some other bits and pieces, and that's cash to actually go and buy stuff, either to start production lines or buy from production lines, restart production lines. There was a suggestion of some lines in possibly Poland, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic to actually get more ammunition, artillery ammunition produced. And also other equipment. And the reason I make the distinction is because it's not a reimbursement fund. The EU also have a reimbursement fund, so they will pay back any country that gifts a load of equipment. So you give a load of tanks or armoured vehicles, artillery systems, what have you. You can then effectively sort of put an expense. Like my expenses from Copenhagen, actually, the mother of all expense bills in to the EU, and hopefully they'll pay it. So that came out of in the press conference. So we asked Mr. Reznikov what he thought. He was very grateful. I said he made great play of thanking all the individuals there for their assistance. Said he was satisfied with the outcome. And this is a quote. He said, "There's no time for fatigue. In a marathon, you need energy, and the energy here is money." So it was. They were pleased with the conference. There were more pledges of support for training in terms of people to do the training and locations. I asked Mr. Reznikov if he thought expanding the training and training for a direct purpose, for this war, whether that would mean that the training areas and the soldiers doing the training could be targeted were at any greater risk of being targeted by Russia. And he said no. He said it would be madness for Russia to take the next stage into a third world war. That's a quote from Mr. Reznikov. But it is one thing to keep our eye on as Ukraine has more battlefield success. I would imagine more. There'll be a huge effort to look after these training areas, but I don't think there's any immediate danger or threat. It would be quite something for Russia to take these places on because, of course, they are NATO countries, most of them, and NATO locations. So unlikely, but not one to discount entirely. And then there were some more details on the demining. So as well as training and money, there were a big outcome from the conference yesterday was that Iceland is going to take the lead on demining, both on land and sea. So I asked the Icelandic foreign minister, now apologies, I've been practicing this all morning, so here we go. Thors Kolbrun Reykjfjord Gifeidatir. I can only apologise if I've absolutely mangled that. But I asked the Icelandic minister if she thought, or some more details about this, and how that's going to happen if Iceland put personnel into Ukraine to do the demining or a train-the-trainer package. But if they go into Ukraine, doesn't that run the risk of coming into direct conflict with Russia? And I said, we should display my gross ignorance. I said, does that not put the risk of Iceland, troops from Iceland being in conflict with Russia? And she went, no, it's actually very, very simple. We haven't got any troops. So off I rush, go and do a quick bit of research, which I possibly should have done beforehand. Apologies. Iceland, the only member in NATO that doesn't have a standing army. So there are no troops. They've got a coast guard with air defence assets and naval artillery and what have you, but there's no actual army for Iceland. They do, however, have a crisis response unit which comes under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So the minister I was chatting to, this is an unarmed peacekeeping force, about 200 people. It's been involved in a lot of UN missions, Afghanistan, Kosovo, and so on and so forth. And it's likely that these demining instructors will come from this force to train Ukrainians, like I say, both at land and sea. Initially, I was told afterwards, went back and asked through UK channels for a bit of clarification, and by which time, of course, I knew all about Iceland not having an army and et cetera, et cetera. But I went back through UK MOD channels and got a bit more detail. That the initial work is going to take place outside of Ukraine. So the instruction, whether or not Iceland will ever have any of these crisis response unit personnel in the country or on the water, is yet to be seen. Unlikely, but not certainly not definitely out of the question. And she said that Iceland have been given the role because they have experience and knowledge, and was very pleased to be able to do what they can. And this is, I remember yesterday I was saying that these donor conferences, it's not all about everybody just putting a load of weapons in a load of money, because not everyone has weapons and money. And this is an example where Iceland, who has a very niche capability and is light in other areas, are able to lean in and do what they can. So that'll be one to watch. That'll be an interesting one as that gets going. I'll try and find out where it's happening, and that'd be quite good to go and visit that, the demining activity. But yeah, and so those are the main outcomes from the Copenhagen conference. The next one, so this is under the umbrella of the Ramstein process, Ramstein Air Base in Germany, the US Air Base in Germany, the location of the first big US-sponsored donor conferences. So this is a similar vein, but this was kick-started by Ben Wallace, the British Defence Secretary. So this is almost kind of Ramstein light. They haven't really got a title for it, but it's another military aid donor conference. The next one in this series. I think the difference basically is that this focuses on a bit of kit, but mainly money and training, whereas Ramstein is mainly the kit. So this process, next one is late September. No idea where yet, but I'll be there. And that was that's the update from yesterday.
Thanks very much, Dom. So I want to turn now to what's been a big story we've been following on this podcast now for several days. Plumes of smoke on Thursday rose above the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, a low-slung grey complex on the banks of the river Dnieper. having occupied the plant since early March, we understand the Russian forces have begun shelling Ukrainian towns in the surrounding area from behind its nuclear shield. Now, we're very lucky to have on the podcast Hamish de Breton Gordon, who, as I say, is a chemical weapons expert and was formerly a British Army officer for 23 years, commanding officer of the UK's Joint Chemical, Biological, Radiological and Nuclear Regiment and NATO's Rapid Reaction Battalion. Hamish, just how dangerous is the situation in Zaporizhzhia from your perspective?
Good afternoon, Francis and Dom. Thanks for having me on. Well, nuclear power stations are inherently safe. However, having fighting around them and the chance for accident, and everybody knows about Chernobyl and Fukushima and 3 Mile Island, is not ideal. In fact, having Russian troops around there is crazy. It's bonkers. Although the power station has been very well constructed, there are 6 reactors there, all cocooned in a sort of a concrete esophagus, which allegedly will take a strike from a crashed aeroplane. They're not designed to withstand attacks from precision weapons and, say, thermobaric missiles. So to weaponize them, as the Russians seems to do, to me is incredibly reckless. And we've seen that conventionally the Russians have not had a huge amount of success against a lesser equipped military. My experience seeing them in Syria over the last 10 years is they sometimes go to unconventional. So weaponizing a power station like Zaporizhzhia would be very much in their lines. I think it's unlikely that a stray artillery shell would create any sort of chemical or any radiological dispersion. However, I do understand there's quite a lot of spent fuel around the place and other contaminated areas which could create some sort of radiological contamination. So to answer your question in a roundabout way, yeah, incredibly dangerous, and it's something that we, the international community, NATO, et al., need to sort out as the main priority at the moment, because any accident there could have a global effect as far as contamination is concerned.
Thank you, Hamish. And in your professional opinion, is this the closest we've come in our lifetimes, at least, or certainly my lifetime, for a sort of another Chernobyl? Is this the greatest risk that we've had, certainly in Europe, perhaps the world, of that kind of incident, do you think?
Absolutely. What really concerns me, there's a chap called General Vasilyev, who is commanding the 500-troop garrison at Zaporizhzhia. First of all, for a general to be commanding 500 troops is extraordinary. You know, a British general would expect to command, 5 or 10,000 troops. Now, this fellow is head of Russia's CBRN. In effect, he's doing the same job that I used to do for the British military. But, I was trained in countering chemical and biological, radiological, nuclear attack and preventing it happening, whereas I expect General Vasilyev is more in the offensive nature. So the fact that he's there, the fact that he claims that he has wired with explosives the site, and if he has put explosives within the reactors, then that is a different story. That could really create a meltdown and a huge fallout across a wide area, east and west. So that concerns that. The other element I think that needs to be considered here is Soviet doctrine, and the Russians seem to be following Soviet doctrine in Ukraine, would allow commanders to use nuclear weapons if that would stave off defeat. And one of the things about Zaporizhzhia, strategically, it's in a key position, strategic position, just north of the sort of Crimea. Any counteroffensive by the Ukrainians south is going to have to go via there. And, if the Ukrainians are successful, as one hopes they will be, then, the Russians might see that as an excuse for them to use Zaporizhzhia in effect as a sort of a nuclear weapon. So I I think we're at a really dangerous stage at the moment. No cards seem to be off the table. Putin has no concern about collateral damage or civilian casualties. Obviously, or not obviously, but it would appear his only thought is about winning, and winning at all costs. And I think we the international community and NATO, were very slow to the Ukraine problem. I think some of our standing back in Syria, not reacting when Assad used a lot of chemical weapons, really emboldened Putin. He really didn't think that we were going to do anything about Ukraine. Now that we have, we need to keep up the pressure, and he needs to be absolutely clear that using Zaporizhzhia as a nuclear device, if you like, or any use of tactical nuclear weapons, will get an equal and greater response from NATO, because we must persuade him absolutely not to do this. And quite frankly, all the other ills and problems we're suffering around the world at the moment, I don't want to sound trite, but are pretty irrelevant if Zaporizhzhia goes up and we get involved in some sort of nuclear conflict.
Thank you, Hamish. Dom, you've been listening to what Hamish has just been saying. What are your reactions and questions?
Yeah, thanks, Francis. Hi, Hamish. Great to chat again. I'd like to focus for a moment on Zaporizhzhia and then sort of zoom out, if we may, to Russia's CBRN capabilities more broadly. But just sticking with Zaporizhzhia for a moment, the big difference. We've seen Russia use chemical, biological, radiological weapons before. Here in Britain, we've seen polonium-210 used against or murdered Alexander Litvinenko, the Russian dissident, in 2016, I think, and the Novichok attack against Sergei Skripal in May 2018. But this would be entirely. There's no way of denying this. Anything that happens at Zaporizhzhia, even a partial destruction, if they try to do that, try to get a sort of limited radiation release. I mean, there's absolutely no way that this would be deniable. So do you think there's more risk? They've shown themselves to be very cavalier with this stuff in the past, but do you think there's more risk now? They consider the risk calculus to be the same here in this military context?
Dom, hi. Yeah, great to catch up. I think you raise a really valid point here that it is, they have got away with all of this in the past, and we haven't done very much about it. Are they prepared to take that risk? They appear to take, any risk seems to be acceptable at the moment, and you'll know better than I, having recently been there. It strikes me that things are not going as planned. The fact that this chap Vasilyev is there really is a concern to me, and I think if it meant that they don't lose, they could well use this as a sort of a pseudo nuclear weapon as such. I think. I know we're going to talk about the nuclear capability in a minute, but they're tactical nuclear weapons. At least we are going to get some indication, because we will see them moving. Whereas Zaporizhzhia, if it is wired up as Vasilyev says, we might not get very much notice. And I think I don't often agree with Antonio Guterres, head of the UN. But his call for a demilitarised zone around Zaporizhzhia seems to me to be the least worst and the most likely way out of this. But it is going to mean that the UN, I expect, are going to have to put boots on the ground. But going back to the Geneva Convention and the rules of war, these places should be protected, as should schools and hospitals and churches and mosques, etc. But again, we saw in Syria and we're seeing now in Ukraine. People like Putin just don't follow those rules. So we have got to be absolutely firm in our determination to make sure that Putin understands that something like this would be unacceptable, and this time NATO would act.
And where do you think this sits in terms of Russian doctrine, i.e. the use of tactical nuclear weapons? We know is in their doctrine. They talk about it a lot. They see it as a response to battlefield defeat. So they've actually sort of put down in black and white almost when they would use it. It's up then for us to interpret what would be a battlefield defeat. But in terms of biological, chemical, radiological weapons, is there anything that we know from their doctrine about how they would approach the use of them?
Well, in theory, of course, they don't have any. they signed the Chemical Weapons Convention, and in 2017 declared to the world that they got rid of all their chemical weapons, whereas they're claiming that the Americans and others hadn't. Of course, the next year, as you mentioned earlier, they used the most deadly chemical agent ever produced, Novichok, in my hometown, in fact, Salisbury, where I'm talking to you from today. So we sort of know they have a chemical weapons program. The biological weapons program, again, they claim that they don't have any. Again, there are people who believe that might not be the case. So, I mean, they in theory have no doctrine for the use of chemical and biological weapons. They do, or the Soviets had doctrine for the use of nuclear weapons, but as part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and START and all the rest of it, the view was that, apart from mutually assured destruction, there would be no use of nuclear weapons. As far as the weaponization of Zaporizhzhia, I mean, that is a really difficult one and an interesting one. When I was the Peshmerga's chemical weapons advisor, the Peshmerga are the northern Iraqi Kurd military forces. I was their advisor for 2 years in the fight against Islamic State between 2015 and 17. Islamic State blew up a massive sulfur mine and factory, a place called Al-Mishraq, south of Mosul, which had a strategic effect because the downwind hazard, the contamination, stopped the Iraqi advance in its tracks, and that proved very effective. I've sort of mentioned Russia's unconventional tactics in Syria, and I think this would be seen as an unconventional asymmetric tactic. Whether they have doctrine in it, I don't know, but we've already seen them blow up several chemical factories in Ukraine, which have created a toxic hazard. And in my opinion, it's one of the things they horrifically have learned from Syria is that if you attack civilians, they are more likely to give up than the military, as it were. And if the people lose their will to resist, then defeat quickly follows. And it's horrific to say it, but that seems to be a tactic that the Russians have. If it's in their doctrine, then that is horrific. So I don't think, a very long-winded answer to your question, Dom, I don't think the weaponization of something like Zaporizhzhia is necessarily in their doctrine, but it does appear to be in their tactics, techniques and procedures, which is shocking.
Yes, it absolutely is. Can you just talk us through either directly Zaporizhzhia or a nuclear power plant, a generic nuclear power plant? What makes a nuclear power plant? Where are the vulnerable areas? How are they monitored? And what do we know of this place? Because we've only got Vasilyev's word for it, I think, that it's rigged with explosives. So how does the world monitor these sites? And are they, is every part as vulnerable as anywhere else?
Well, I'm not a nuclear scientist, but I've been involved, obviously, in protecting nuclear sites when I was commander of the CBRN regiment. All nuclear sites are monitored and inspected by the International Atomic Energy Agency. That's a UN agency, and those are the head of it, Mario Grossi, I think his name is. He is the one who said we need to get in there and find out exactly what's happening. So that's absolutely what should happen. And in normal terms, that is how these things are monitored. The safety regulations are made sure that they're up to speed. Now, there are areas of vulnerability or more vulnerability than others. Now, an awful lot of work has gone in to nuclear power stations before they first appeared in the sort of 50s to make them safer. And this particular site has 6 reactors, all of them encased in this sort of concrete esophagus. Unlike Chernobyl was one reactor which basically melted down and exploded and spread contamination. Now, that was a much older reactor and much more vulnerable. I think the areas of vulnerability tend to be, there will be spent fuel, that is fuel that's gone past its useful date but still highly radioactive. That will probably not be stored in such a secure site. And a huge amount of water is used to cool these things down, which can become contaminated. So, the actual reactors themselves, where the nuclear fuel would be the area of most concern. And if Vasilyev has wired them with explosives, then that would be a concern. Now, it might well be that the concrete over the top might prevent, a widespread of contamination going over a wide area. I think I said at the beginning, the Chernobyl contamination, a heck of a lot of it reached the UK, and a lot of that fell in North Wales, and it was several years before farmers up there could sell their product again. One of the dreadful things with nuclear isotopes is their half-life, if you like. How long they're active, can be a heck of a long time. You have something like polonium, which is a few days, and one of the reasons that the FSB, the Russian Secret Service, used polonium to kill Alexei Litvinenko was that they knew that the stuff would disappear fairly quickly. But you then come on to the sort of nuclear fuels, which have a half-life of years and years and years, so will hang around for a long time. So this is probably, being a fairly modern nuclear power station, is safe and resilient to accident and even an aircraft crashing into it. But I think never in anybody's wildest dreams did people think that they would be weaponized, and to have troops amongst it firing missiles out is something that I'm sure nobody in all the contingency plans they did would have come up with it, because it would have been absolutely ridiculous. And that is why we need to be so determined to sort this out, because if somebody is prepared to do what the Russians are doing, what Vasilyev are doing, quite frankly, I'm not sure what they're not prepared to do.
Absolutely. And just finally, is there a ray of hope here? I think the message from the US and China was very similar. They were calling for, I think, restraint, and I'm not sure if they were calling for UN action, but they were very much on the same page when it came to this particular issue. Do you think this is one area that could be developed, and what do you think the UN should do?
Well, I agree, Tom. If the Chinese are involved, that makes me feel a little bit happier, because I think China and the US working together with NATO, is a pretty powerful organisation, and the Russians, would be crazy not to look at that. So I think that gives hope. The Russian, I gather the local Russian mayor or the commander of the Oblast has said, we will allow inspectors in a few weeks' time. I think we've got to enable that. We've absolutely got to enable that and push that home. And Ukrainian military, whatever action they've got to do, hopefully they will show restraint, because any provocation that Russians will see might set them to press that button. And if we can get people on the ground, then hopefully, I think what one is just. I don't say hope is the wrong word to use, but I'm sure there are the checks and balances in the Kremlin. First of all, to make sure that Putin just doesn't go and press the red button, and secondly, that a rogue commander doesn't trying to have a strategic impact by weaponizing a nuclear site or another site on their own volition. So, although this all sounds dreadful and horrific, as long as the world's leaders, US, China, and UK, focus on this and sort it out, then we should hopefully avoid, a global disaster. But the potential is there. Although, I won't say it's unlikely. The potential is there, but we must sort it out above anything else that is vexing us at the moment.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Hamish. Really, really interesting to hear your perspective. We've spoken now about the military aspects of this war. We've spoken about the nuclear today. And I want to now just sort of return more to the human experience of what's been happening, not only this week, but also since the war began back in February. So I want to turn now to Mariam Naim, who is a Ukrainian researcher of Afghan origin, who's here to offer some insights on not only Ukrainian culture, but also experiences and reactions to the war, not only her own, but also more broadly amongst Ukrainian people. So, Mariam, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Could you just introduce yourselves to our listeners and talk perhaps a little bit about your experience of the war since it began?
Hi, thank you a lot for having me. This is a very nice opportunity as well. Thank you. So, my name is Mariam, as you already said. So, I guess most of the time I can call myself a cultural researcher. But of course, since war, I guess the easiest way to introduce myself is just call myself Ukrainian. If we talk about war and how it's actually connected to my family, it's pretty interesting because the World War has always been connected with my family and its history. The war of the USSR with Afghanistan became the reason why my father and my brother left Afghanistan, like more than 30 years ago. After death of my brother's mom, we have different mothers. So due to the war, my father went to Moscow to do also his PhD, but the main reason, of course, was political situation at that time. He met my mother there. She's Ukrainian, and this is how all my family appears to be in Ukraine. So this is very interesting because it's interesting to talk with my brothers and hear what do they remember from that first war that they faced when they were kids and now. So 25 years after the first war, one of my brothers was mobilized, and again he fought the Russian aggressive expansion in 2015 in eastern part of Ukraine, and since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the same brother Masty again went to the front line, and in June he was blown up by the mine. He lost an eye, but right now his condition is stabilized. He's even making jokes about that. And this is very interesting that the irony is that my brother remembered Russian soldiers as children, and now he meet them again. So for the current moment, all my family is in Ukraine, and I'm not. I'm in the US currently.
Thank you. Interesting to hear your experience and of your brother. Obviously, we're glad that he's okay and recovering. What's your sense talking to him about the general state of morale amongst Ukrainian soldiers?
This is actually very complicated questions. Not because it's not very nice to talk about this. It's because there is a lot of levels right now, a lot of levels of senses. So right now, while talking to you, of course, I know that I'm talking to people from the western part of the world. I mean, compared to Ukraine, and I need to filter myself because there is some specific topic that I can discuss with you and I cannot. And I know that this is something very typical for all Ukrainians right now who are speaking in English or try to explain what's happening in Ukraine. This is the same subject about soldiers and military system. There is a lot of levels in this situation. Of course, on the surface, this is kind of understandable for everyone that soldiers, everyone just doing their job, and of course, everyone believed we will win. This is something that's inevitable for us. But of course, there's a lot of other problems. Like my brother told me yesterday that when you go into war, you are typically they preparing you for 2 months, but nobody prepare you for peace. So this is interesting because we start to talk about what does he feel after coming to the civil life, and actually how he's adapting or try to coexist with the new life. So right now, to be honest, I don't think we can discuss how exactly our Ukrainian soldiers feel like. The only one important thing is that they're doing their job. They know that they're fighting for the land. It's a very different perspective rather than Russian soldiers. This is very important. So this is like a civil act of your responsibility as a person, I guess. But of course, I'm very grateful to all of them. But in the same time, I just want this war to be over as fast as possible. Of course, with Ukraine that will win.
Thank you. Now, I was very struck by something that you've written about on Twitter. You describe yourself as a Russian-speaking person of colour who was born and raised in Ukraine, and you talk about how this puts you in a position to speak on the issue of nationalism and neo-Nazism in Ukraine. What are your insights on this very big question?
This was important. So this was actually this thread that I wrote on Twitter. This was the reason why I even create my Twitter account. So I didn't want to do any social media about that. But I realized that when we have more and more discussion about Ukrainian far rights, and every time journalists are talking to Ukrainians, and most Ukrainians are of course Slavic people, and we receive this information that there is no racism in Ukraine. It doesn't sound right for a lot of people, and people cannot trust this kind of information. So I thought this will be the reason why I can talk about this, because I know what is racism. I experienced racism in different countries. So I thought I can describe what is the issue with nationalism and Ukrainian nationalism specifically. So to talk about Ukrainian nationalism, we first have to establish the context of the relationship between Ukraine and Russia. Now, this is something that we have lack of this information, not in the Western world or, in journalism, but it's also in Ukraine. So this is something that me as Ukrainian, we discuss this right now with other Ukrainians to understand this relationship between Ukraine and Russia. And this is not just a countries that share in the common border. Our relationship is what empire and colony. So typically, Russian Empire erases the culture of their colonies, which is completely normalized, and typically captured lands were named Russia after they were ethnically cleansed, and of course, for Ukrainians, nationalism. This is kind of a way to defend their culture. This is something that Eva Thompson was writing about. This is a prominent scholar of post-colonial view on Eastern European history. She was saying that there is distinction between imperialistic nationalism, reaching out of aggressively to subjugate and exploit potential colonies, and defensive nationalism, poised to preserve tradition and identities. So defensive nationalism is common to people whose identity is in existential danger, typically what we have in Ukraine. So this is something that actually can explain what happened in Ukraine and explain Azov and other far-right discussions. So media was talking a lot about regiment of Azov, but the founding year of Azov is actually 2014, and this is the same year of Russia attack on Ukraine, 2014. So the current rise of Ukrainian nationalist and far-right movement is to a large extent caused by Russian expansion of aggression. So this was very important to highlight, because I guess this is something that wasn't very understandable from perspective of Europe. And I can see why, because in the same time in Europe there is a big wave of far-right political parties that became more and more popular, and I can see why it looked like another danger. But this is a very different perspective, because again, we all generalization could be very dangerous right now. So if we even talk about Ukrainian nationalism and a Ukrainian problem with far rights, I cannot say it's a problem, but anyways. We need to always look to the context. It's not the same. It's not the same political party as in France. It's not the same political party as in Hungary. It's a completely different cultural context. And to understand whole reason and the whole problem of Russian-Ukrainian war, we need to look into the history. And this is what I think we lack of right now. We need to look deeper into Ukrainian relationship with Russia, because this is something that I also noticed, that culturally people were more focused on Russia and history of Russia and everything that was connected to that country, but not on Ukraine, because it wasn't so popular topic to discuss. And right now we need to shift this situation and look more into the Ukrainian history.
Thank you. It's so interesting hearing that perspective, that this sort of rise of far-right nationalism within Ukraine is actually in many ways fired by the Russian aggression that's been happening in the country since 2014. But I'm very struck as well by this. We talk a lot about the sort of nationalism and racist elements within Ukraine, and indeed that's something that, of course, Russian propaganda has picked up on. But something we hear less about, Mariam, is how Ukraine has improved in recent years in these areas. It's a very different country than it was only a handful of years ago. I just wondered if you could talk about that and perhaps what Ukrainians feel the future of Ukraine looks like.
Yeah, so this is another topic, and you're completely right. I can compare situation with racism, for example, in Ukraine, but I can just discuss LGBT rights. So this is something that I'm very proud of. And of course, I'm proud right now that I'm Ukrainian, but even before, it was one of the reasons why I was proud to be Ukrainian, because I could see how my country and my society, we are all together growing into something that I can see as a better representation of my state. So I can't even describe how fast and how rapidly Ukrainian society start to work on the homophobic problems. How LGBT rights, we start to have a parade, which is completely I couldn't even imagine that more than 10 years ago. And I remember this feeling in Ukraine, in Kyiv, when you start to understand that this became new norm, this is normalized. And I was very happy about that. And of course, this is a huge shift for Ukrainian societies, which was pretty conservative, to be honest. And I guess if you look at at a lot of countries in Eastern Europe, this is a kind of typical thing to be very conservative towards this topic. So I guess Ukrainian society did a huge job in this area, and continue to evolve. So right now we have a lot of LGBT people in the army, and we are very proud of it. So we're talking about this. We're forcing this topic all the time. This is the same, but this is more personal view, of course. So of course I face racism in Ukraine, but not only in Ukraine, all over the world. And I guess this is something that we should admit, that racism exists everywhere. It very depends on what extent. So in Ukraine, racism, it's less structural, like compared to European one, for example. But again, the worst thing that I ever experienced in Ukraine was something around maybe 15 or 13 years ago. For the last 10 years or like even more, I didn't have any problems with the racism in Ukraine. Even more, I did social experiment. I wrote an article about that. So I was wearing a hijab for 10 days in Kyiv just to see reaction of the people, because it was the time when the discussion kind of appeared to be in Europe. Do people can people wear hijab or burqa or not? So I was very curious, because we haven't even had this kind of conversation in Ukraine. In Ukraine, we don't have a lot of immigrants. People are it's very, we have kind of the same ethnicity all the time. So I didn't even know how will actually Ukrainian react to this. And it was very funny, because a reaction of society just shocked me, because everyone was super polite to me. I didn't receive any aggressive behavior. And for me, this was another sign that I don't even know how actually Ukrainian society changed through these years. So yes, this is another thing. We had this idea, and we talk about these ideas in 2013 when Maidan started, that we went on Maidan for the European values. But to be honest, if we go deeper to this conversation, we didn't even know what is European values. And right now, we start to understand that this is, maybe it wasn't right way to call it. It actually was our future Ukrainian values, or what we will see as a value at some point. So it's very nice to see that Ukraine evolves so fast, and I'm very proud, to be honest.
Fascinating. Thank you, Mariam. Dom, you've been listening to what Mariam has been saying. Have you got any questions for her?
I do, yes. Hi, Mariam. Thanks so much for taking part here. I'd just be really interested in how you've been received in America. What view you have of how the war is viewed there, and the kind of questions that are asked of you. What's the first thing that people ask when if they meet you for the first time and discover you're Ukrainian and from over there in that war? I'd be really interested in your perspective from that.
This is interesting, but right now everything that I'm saying, this is just my subjective view, so I cannot say that this is everywhere. I can say, to be honest, compared to Europe, because before that I was in Europe, this reaction made me feel much better, because they know what is Ukraine. I mean, and they are openly discuss this. So this is true. First thing that they, when they found out that I'm Ukrainian, to be honest, first thing they are typically shocked, because I don't look like a Ukrainian person. So I need to explain that I am not Ukrainian. I'm not only Ukrainian. I'm Ukrainian and Afghani origin. After that, they try to show me their empathy all the time. They're trying to explain that they are very sorry, and they ask more about my family. Typically in Europe, it's not happening. Typically, is people in Europe don't want to talk about this thing. Maybe it's because war is much closer than to US, so it's more like a threat. It's not. Maybe people in Europe want to avoid this topic, and this is what I felt more and more. This is another reason why I feel a bit lonely. To be, as a lot of Ukrainians, to be in Europe, because you kind of are talking too much about war. But to be honest, I guess the another reason why in US it's much easier to support Ukraine, as I told you, is because it's far away. Like, I mean, the front zone is much far than in Europe. So it's much easier to discuss something that doesn't have a specific and very concrete threat towards you.
That's fascinating. And if I just may ask just one more. I mean, you mentioned a lot about racism. You've told us today. I just wonder how you felt about the situation from Afghanistan, and if you have any contacts there, and quite what you feel about. I can't speak for other countries, but I think here in the UK we need to have a discussion about why we have been very open to Ukrainian citizens fleeing the war, and less so, I think, for Afghan nationals either fleeing the war then or fleeing the Taliban now. And I just wondered if you felt there was an unconscious racism running through our society still, or I think it's still there, but a much bigger unconscious racism that we don't acknowledge, and whether or not we are vulnerable to this charge that we are more open to Ukrainians because they, quote, look like us, and Afghan citizens might not. I mean, am I being unfair there, or do you think that, have you detected that in Western society?
This is a very complicated question to answer, because right now I need to filter everything what I'm saying and be very, very accurate. So first thing, to be honest, I guess yes. But second, and this is also important, Afghanistan is much more far away compared to Ukraine. And this is, I guess, also make a huge difference at this point. So we cannot talk about, okay, would we have the same situation if Afghani people, or like people who look less like, Caucasian people, live closer to UK or Europe? It's very hard to discuss, but I guess, of course, yes, it's connected problems, but in the same time, a lot of Ukrainians right now talk about this thing. A lot of Ukrainians talk about the problems in other countries, and I guess this is our right as Ukrainians to help. And our president even were talking about this. This is another reason why I'm very proud, because he was discussing these kind of problems with other countries while talking about problems in Ukraine, which is, I guess, the perfect way to describe that we have systematic problem in the world. It's not just Russia. There is a lot of problems in the world. So to be honest, I guess, yes, this is connected, but in the same time, why I need to be very specific right now, because it doesn't mean that the world shouldn't help Ukraine. Of course, there is a problem, and to be honest, culturally, what was happened to Afghani culture or Afghani people, this is just horrible. And to be honest, not only Afghani people. This is we can see a lot of atrocities in the world right now. but it's also, as I told you about, we need to go deeper into the cultural context of Ukraine and Russia. This is the same when we talk about Afghanistan or Palestine. We need to go deeper into the topic to discuss it, because we cannot make a generalization. It's not the same as Ukraine and Russia problem with Afghanistan. It's completely different context. But we also need to understand that what happened in other places in the world, it's also our responsibilities, because there was another perception that I felt in Europe, that somehow we feel like countries are separated from each other. We didn't have any connections, and what's happening in your country is not connected to what happened in my country, which is, I think, completely unfair, because we live in one system. We coexist together as a people, as a society, and as a countries. So, of course, economically, what happened to my country is actually have a lot of impact onto another country, and we need to distinguish that. That it's not. We cannot say that this is not our responsibility. What's happened in a different part of the world, and this is another topic that I try to cover as well. Like that, some countries in Europe are responsible of what we see right now in the war in Ukraine. Because I remember how in 2017, I guess, we were in Kyiv. We were on the protest next to the France embassy because we find out that France are selling weapons to Russia in the time when we already had war in Donbass, which was completely absurd for me, because you know where this weapon will go to, and at the same time you're saying that the war in Ukraine, you're saying it's bad, but at the same time you're selling weapons. So I guess this is another problem, and I guess right now we can see that world need our consolidation as never before. I mean, of course, as some time before as well, but right now this is for sure a big problem. And I guess the problem with other countries is a matter of our consolidation as well.
Thank you, Mariam. It's really interesting hearing your nuanced thoughts on this question. Before we wrap up with our final thoughts, I just had one other question for you. I was very struck by something you tweeted, which I'll quote in full. I just wanted to ask for your reflections on it. So you said, "We Ukrainians are very lonely because we know that no one understands us. You're a party pooper who always talks about war. Yet at the same time, I've never spoken so many tender words to my loved ones and friends. I've never felt so much support. I had a feeling that the whole world has got my back." This seems like a really common theme among Ukrainians that we've spoken to. Would it be too far to say that the war has given your life a new sense of meaning?
I guess not the meaning, but the purpose. Yes, this is for sure. And I know it will be very weird to hear, but there is some positive things in war. I mean, it made everything much clearer. Like, you start to understand what is actually valuable, what is not. I guess, and sorry for these pauses, it's a little bit complicated for me to describe. I will always remember how I wrote to my best friend who was in Kyiv at this point, and just try to imagine yourself in my shoes. We were just chatting about something, and I asked him what he's doing, and he said that he's doing Molotov cocktails because in case it was first days of Russian invasion. Because in case Russian will be in the city, in the center of Kyiv, he wants to fight back at least with something. And this horrible feeling that this is your reality. Like, it's not some movies. This is your reality right now. Your friend is doing Molotov cocktails because he might be dead by tomorrow. We don't know that. And of course, to be honest, this is something that we are doing all the time with my friends. We're just saying how we love each other as an act of saying goodbye in case we will never talk to each other again. To do it more than once, and we're doing that more than once, this is just so painful. And right now, this is another phase that we're facing right now. We know that more men will needed to go to war, and of course I know that some of my friends will be there as well, and I don't know right now actually how to live with this feeling right now, because it's very painful. This is another reason why we as Ukrainians feel more united, because we have this collective trauma. this is something that changed I guess there is a big difference. There is huge gap of these universes of understanding the world. When you saw how people got killed in your country and not. This is completely different realities. And of course, it's much harder when you try to describe this to a person from another country, when you try to use empathy or you try to explain it in another way with words, it's not the same, because even to go deeper into this grief of another person, it's very painful. So I can see why some people in Europe want to hide from this topic. It's completely understandable, because to be honest, we did the same with other countries. I did the same with another country. But this is the thing. But from Ukrainians, I don't need to explain. They already knows what do I feel, and I know what do they feel. This is so I don't wait for them some act of empathy to understand my feelings better. So for sure, I right now have a much clearer purpose. I know what I as a person should do with my future life. And of course, for me, it became very clear what is actually important. And you hear about this thing in the books all the time, that communication with people and connections are the most important thing that in the world, or something that unites us the most. But I can say that from this perspective, from another reality right now, connections, friendship, and love that you have in the relationship, it's not only important or the most important thing you have in your life. It's actually the most beautiful thing you have in your life, because the feeling, this amount of love and care that I receive, it's just beautiful itself. And this is something that war showed me. I didn't know about that. I thought it's just important, but not as beautiful as it is.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it really helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. We're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. This week, we've had emails from Guatemala, Chile, Okinawa, Japan, Melbourne, Australia, California in the United States, and the Bavarian Alps in Germany. I'm quite jealous of that last one. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Gemma Farrell.